Yes, you have in fact read the title correctly. I did indeed attempt running 60 kilometers through the night as a complete beginner. Was it easy? Definitely not. But I was optimistic that I could run 60 kilometers within 12 to 15 hours. Now, I had no business whatsoever doing this, given that the furthest I've ever ran prior to the 60K was actually 19 kilometers as part of a self-organized half marathon I attempted last November, which I clearly did not end up finishing. Before I actually get into the paternal details and the events that actually unfolded on the day of my 60K, let me share with you a little bit more as to why I decided to torture myself to this extreme. Back in July, I saw someone I deeply admire run an ultra marathon, a 100 miler for the 4th of July. So I was deeply inspired by that said influencer, so I decided to do my own iteration of his 100 miler. Keep in mind, he isn't some sort of seasoned athlete nor a marathoner by nature. He's definitely had more miles on foot as compared to me, but like I said, he is in no way a seasoned athlete. So using that as a benchmark, I thought that I'd be able to do something similar, a scaled down version of a 100 miler. And since Singapore's 60th birthday was right around the corner at that point in time, I thought, why not run 60 kilometers for Singapore's 60th birthday? After all, 60 years of independence is a pretty big milestone. And I also wanted some sort of purpose and motivation to keep me going through the night when things got tough. So I went onto Google and searched up 60 kilometers for SG60. And to my surprise, there were a bunch of organizations, non-profit organizations, hosting 60-kilometer charity walks and charity runs throughout the months of July and August. So I decided to partake in Changi Airport's 60-kilometer charity walk, which lasts all the way from July to September. But obviously, I was going to do 60K in one day. And if you are curious, that charity actually aimed to raise awareness for youth at risk and children with disabilities, and that cause really stood out to me. So I decided to run 60 kilometers in support of Changi Airport's charity because I didn't want my efforts to go to waste. Now, don't get me wrong, 60K is a lot for a completely new runner like me, and I was well aware of what I was getting myself into. I even factored in the possibility of things going south halfway and the repercussions that could possibly have arose from taking on such a challenge. As impulsive as I might appear to be, I actually sat on this idea for a while and did some research to the feasibility of this whole endurance feat. And honestly, a lot of the research I did was for my own reassurance, but nonetheless, some people said that this was going to be possible, while majority of people said that this in itself is just a completely stupid idea. But nonetheless, I was more or less fixated on taking on this challenge, so I decided to run with it anyway. So I decided to run along East Coast Park, specifically between areas C and D, which are like 2.4 kilometers in distance apart from each other. So one loop will make up 5 kilometers. So that's when I decided to adopt the last man standing format, whereby I run 5 kilometers every hour for 12 hours straight. And if you do your math, that's 60 kilometers in total, which didn't seem too bad in my mind because I was more or less confident that I could run 5 kilometers in an hour or even under an hour. So in fact, I thought of running at a 10-minute per kilometer pace, whereby I have 10 minutes at the end of every lap to stretch out and to fuel, to hydrate, etc., etc. So that didn't really seem too bad in my mind. It seemed like a pretty feasible plan to execute. But speaking of fuel, one of the major challenges I faced running at East Coast Park was finding ways to hydrate and fuel. It wasn't so much of a challenge logistically because there was a 7-Eleven at my pit stop which was open 24 hours, so that wasn't too bad. But one of the primary concerns I had before even deciding that I was going to run at East Coast Park was going to be cost. I had to buy drinks, I had to buy food every hour or so, right? And that would eventually compound at the end of my whole run. And so that is one of the reasons why I initially considered running around my neighborhood so that I could fuel whenever I needed. But I didn't really like the idea of running around my neighborhood because there isn't much to see around my neighborhood. And I like the idea of running along the coast. Just running through the breeze and running next to the sea is something I really enjoy. So I decided to just go with my plans and run at East Coast Park. And now let me actually share with you the events that unfolded on the day of my 60-kilometer run. So it's been exactly a month ago since I ran 60 kilometers. I ran on the 25th of July, the night of the 25th. I know National Day falls on the 9th of August, but I had a production shoot on the 8th of August. So I knew I was going to be tired going into the 60K, so I didn't want to risk it. Plus, I had a bunch of assignments due that weekend, plus a presentation the following Monday. So I didn't want to risk an injury and the possibility of going to the presentation or cripple. So obviously, I decided to run the 60K a few weeks earlier, which was the 25th of July. And so now let me actually get into what went down. So I started my run around 8-ish p.m., relatively early into the night. And funny story, right before I started running, I had major anxiety. I honestly didn't know what to expect. I was thinking of all the worst outcomes. But once I started running, the anxiety somehow just dissipated. Like I started just feeling at peace once I started running, partly because the environment at East Coast Park at that point in time was pretty lively. East Coast Park on a Friday is always pretty lively. We have like a bunch of campers, people barbecuing, etc., all that jazz. So running along East Coast Park in the end wasn't such a bad idea. So I started my first kilometer lap and ran my first 5 kilometers at an 8-ish, 9-ish minute per kilometer pace, which was slightly faster than expected. Funny story, actually halfway around the 3-kilometer mark, it started pouring pretty heavily. A bunch of park goers, including myself, had to hide under a pavilion for like 20 minutes straight to wait for the rain to stop. But fortunately, I started my run relatively early, so I had some buffer time to spare. Soon enough, the first lap was done, and I was feeling really good. I was feeling really stoked for what was to come, and I stretched out a little bit. I had about 10 minutes to spare. I then went on to do my second lap, which would make up 10 kilometers in total. And that lap went pretty well, but at this point, I knew that I was going to have to keep my pace and heart rate under control if I wanted to sustain through the night. I knew that if I were to go any faster, I would be burnt out in the subsequent next couple of laps. So I decided to incorporate some walking and slow jogging just so that I could keep my heart rate in zone 2. So once the second lap was done, I was still feeling really good. And I, in fact, was a little bit complacent. I thought that I could go one more lap without fueling, which was presumably a bad idea later on. And I'll get into that in the later part of this video too. I did hydrate. I had a water bottle with me the whole time, a plastic water bottle. There were some limitations as to what I was going to bring because I didn't want to carry like a bunch of gels and bunch of food and a vest because that just wasn't feasible in my opinion because I didn't have a lot of those items. So I carried a water bottle with me, and after every lap, I refuel it at the water cooler, which is nearby the 7-Eleven, which I relied on for fuel. So of course I didn't fuel. I decided to go on to my third lap. That third lap was pretty good, but from the third lap onwards, I really saw myself slowing down. I don't know if it's because of insufficient fueling or whatever, but I found myself slowing down a little bit. So right after the third lap, I told myself that I really needed to fuel. So I went into the 7-Eleven, bought a bottle of 100 plus, and rested for like 5-10 minutes before I started on my fourth lap, which would eventually probably be one of, if not the best lap of my whole entire 60K. Why? Because once I ran the fourth lap, I was already at a half marathon distance in. So At that point, I was so glad that, I completed a half marathon, something that I've not ever achieved before. And so the adrenaline was just pumping through me. I felt that I could keep on going through the night. My legs were, of course, a little bit fatigued at the 21K mark, as it should be. The lactic acid was starting to build up and all that, but nothing too severe. I wasn't experiencing any severe aches and pains or anything of that sort. So I decided to continue with my fifth lap. At this point, it was, I think, close to midnight or past midnight. So I continued with my fifth lap, and that took me to 25 kilometers. That lap was pretty average. I don't remember much about that lap. But once I got to 30 kilometers was when things started to really get lonely. At this point in time, it was around 2, 3 a.m. So the atmosphere was really quiet. It was just me and myself. Okay, it wasn't that bad, but it was pretty lonely, and I had to get used to the solitude. But for some odd reason, oddly enough, that peace and solitude somehow was comforting. I don't know why. Like after a while, just running along East Coast Park by myself, no distractions, just felt oddly comforting. So shortly after that lap was done, I think I might have fuel again. Again, my fueling kind of went out of the window at the start, which was something I expected was going to happen because I didn't have a proper fueling station. I didn't have anyone to remind me when to fuel. I initially wanted a bunch of friends to join me on this adventure, but a lot of them were not very willing to take on such a challenge. And my family, understandably, didn't want to stay the night with me because they'd just be sitting there, right? But my dad and mom actually came in the morning around 7 a.m., which is what I'm going to talk about in a few moments. So after the 30-kilometer mark, I started slowing down again. Things just gradually got slower from here. And little did I know, things started going downhill from this point onwards. Right after the 35-kilometer mark, my legs were extremely fried. Both legs felt really heavy, kind of aching. I wouldn't say I experienced any spasms, but both my hamstrings were extremely tight. And so I told myself that I really needed to rest. I really needed to take a break. At this point, the sun was about to rise. So the park started getting lively again. And I was just there essentially dead. I was just trying to stretch out, get some fuel in, and get hydrated before I start on my, at this point, was 8th lap, whereby I'd be a full marathon in. The 8th lap was honestly hell because even after I stretched out my legs, even after I got some fuel and all that, I still felt pretty fatigued. Like I couldn't really run at this point, obviously. So I walked the entirety of my 8th lap, and that took me to 40 kilometers. That was honestly one of the slowest 5K I've ever done. Okay, not really. The subsequent 5K was honestly the slowest 5K I ever done. So at the point, it was, I think, close to 7 a.m. My parents came down. My dad actually advised me to consider taking a break or just quitting as a whole because my right leg, in fact, went into what I think was a knee lock. So my right leg couldn't really bend. So a lot of the pressure I was putting was on my left leg. So if I continue on, my dad told me that I'll be at risk of an injury, but stubborn me decided to continue on with my run. So I ran the subsequent 5K in, I think, more than an hour. So after that 5K, I was at 45 kilometers. Once I hit 45 kilometers, I was like, I might give up. I might give up. Because number one, I obviously couldn't really run much more. And number two, if I was going to walk, I was going to be putting more stress on my left leg, which technically was my good leg, which might lead to some sort of injury. The pain on my right leg, I think, was quite severe from what my parents told me. Like, they saw the way I was walking. They said I looked pretty bad. It looked like I was like severely injured or something, which I'm glad wasn't the case, but I think if I were to push on, that might have been the case. And so we then went for breakfast at the nearby McDonald's at Area C, my favorite part of East Coast Park, sarcastically, not really, it's probably the most lively part of East Coast Park. So we went for breakfast, and I used that time to let my leg kind of recalibrate and rest. But unfortunately, after breakfast, both my legs were still pretty tight. Both my legs were still feeling pretty heavy. So I really considered giving up at this point. But I'm not a quitter, so guess what I did? I decided to rent a hollow ride bike to cycle the subsequent 15 kilometers, which in hindsight wasn't such a bad idea because when you cycle, you don't really use so much of your calf muscles, you use more of your quads. So that kind of let my hamstrings and calves rest while I use my quads, which weren't very much tired at that point in time. So I cycled the remaining 15K, which I so glad I did. I honestly can't imagine how it'd been if I were to have walked that last 15 kilometers because at the end of that day, my legs were pretty achy. I could barely walk properly. I was limping for that whole day. I think I was still limping the next day. So I can't imagine what I'd gotten myself into if I were to have walked that 15K. And so that kind of wraps out the entirety of my 60 kilometers. Now I want to talk about recovery, my recovery process. Surprisingly, it didn't take very long for my body and legs to recover because right after the run, I was feeling pretty mentally fresh. I was feeling pretty good. I probably was a bit tired because I went down for like a 2-hour nap that same evening. But other than that, I didn't really experience any major side effects. And I didn't really have any injuries per se. I had a few blisters. Both my legs were aching. My right leg could initially not bend, but after a while, it started loosening up. So really, I didn't really experience any injuries. And in fact, it only took 2-3 days for my legs to fully heal. 2-3 days later, I could almost walk properly, though I would say my hamstrings still kind of hurt every now and then when I run, especially when I put a lot of tension on them. But I'm so glad that the recovery process was pretty seamless and there wasn't much to actually be concerned about in terms of recovery. Thanks to my Asics Gel Nimbus 26, which I ran in, my tried and true daily trainer, which I really love. I love Max Cushion daily trainers. And okay, I haven't really tried many daily trainers yet. I only had like one daily trainer before this, so it's probably not fair for me to say that this is my favorite. But from what I've heard too, this shoe is pretty good at handling long distance runs. So yeah, I'm so glad that I ran in those. Gave my feet a lot of support. I'm still waiting for Asics to send me a pair of shoes. I'm just kidding. But it'd be nice if they did so. So now, would I ever put myself through such torture again? Definitely, I'd love to embark on many more of these endurance sends. But I think in the meantime, I'm just going to spend more time on foot. I'm going to spend more time building my base because I have my first official race coming up in December, which is going to be Singapore Standard Chartered 10K, which I'm really stoked about. So I think in the meantime, I'm just gonna build up and just clock more wheelie mileage before the Standard Chartered 10K. But hopefully after that, or maybe along the way, I get to do some more of these endurance challenges. And I think in terms of races, I might be planning to do like a half marathon start of next year, start of 2026. But we'll see how that goes. Haven't really committed to that yet. Gonna attempt the 10K first, and then we'll see how it goes. That was honestly such a long video, so much talking. But now, if there's anything I want to leave you with before I even end this video, it'd be this. I wrote this in one of my Instagram captions recently on my 60K post, on my official 60K post. Persistent without wisdom is pride in disguise, or what I like to call pure stupidity. Sometimes winning isn't simply finishing the way you plan. It is your ability to adapt along the way, protect your future, and keep going in a different form. And that was something I really had to embrace this time, given that my legs gave up at the 45-kilometer mark, and I had to cycle the subsequent 15 kilometers. Peace, guys.